Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining me today. It's Mary Maguire here, and I'm going to talk about good girl conditioning and how we're creating that as a cycle, even for young children today, and what the impact is of that as they grow up into adults and pursue their careers. It's something that's very close to my heart. Many of you will know me, and I'm the author of a number of books, The Female Edge being one of them, which is very much about women helping to find authentic success in the workplace, and also The Inclusion Edge, which is very much about helping women helping leaders to feel more confident in spearheading diversity and inclusion in their environment. So, um, very, very passionate about this subject, and I'm delighted that you could join me today. Um, so where are we with the whole issue around gender? Now, good girl conditioning comes down to something that you may have heard of. It's a term. I just come back to it's a term you may have heard of, and it comes down to gender socialization. So many, many years ago, my career was social work. Since then, I've had about 25 years of corporate consulting work. And in the last 4 or 5 years, I've concentrated on two very specific things. One of them is career coaching for women to help them find authentic success in their career and the work that they choose to do. And also diversity and inclusion, helping organisations to build more inclusive cultures of belonging. And what I found is that in my early career as social worker, we talked a lot about gender socialization because we understood that, we all have a life course. We have different structures, different at different stages of our life, and we also found that the way that we encourage boys and girls to behave leads to different outcomes in life. But when I talk about gender socialization, which is what I'm going to start with, what does that conjure up for you? Now, I'd also like to say I can't see the chat live. I can't see all of what you might put in the chat live. But if you are watching, if you are here now, please say hello in the chat. And also, as you go along, if you have got questions, if you have got things you want to share or ask me, please do. And if there's a little bit of delay, bear with me and I'll get back to you about it. But thank you for those of you who can join me live. It's always great. And if you're watching in the playback, also fabulous. And what I'd say is, if you do have comments and it's not live, if you do put them in the comments, I will come back and check regularly, and I'll certainly come back to you. I'll also give you some of my contact details and some of the ways that you can get some of more of the information around the work that I do as part of the chat as well. So where should we start? Gender socialization. Let's look at what that actually looks like in things. So, when it comes to thinking about things like good girl syndrome or good girl conditioning, I wonder what that means to you and what you tend to think about. Um, and here's what I found: it's actually a very hot button for many women because they really do recognise this as something that they experience. Well, if we think of it in terms of gender socialization, what that process is, according to the dictionary, is a process of teaching members of society how to behave according to their gender expectations or their gender roles. And the more strict them gender roles, the more strict them expectations, the harder it is for people who live outside of them rules, live outside of them guidelines, to actually feel that they can be heard, to feel that they're able to express themselves, to feel that they're able to find success on their own terms. So it is a big issue. And it's something that I'd like to share with you some thoughts around it. And also, what happens, what are the behaviours that we're encouraging, what that leads to, and then also how we're seeing that happening in the workplace. So hopefully you're going to find that interesting. But let me start with a story. So once upon a time, there was three particular female characters who were in a story. So you're probably familiar with all of them. So think about the stories we tell our girls around what it means to be female, what it means to be a girl growing up, and what are the things which are the epitome of their ambition in life. So here's three common stories: Rapunzel, Snow White, and Sleeping Beauty. So if we just take a moment to think about that, what are the themes that are often coming up when we actually use these as stories? What are the fairy tales telling us about the way that we're expected to behave as part of our gender? And again, if you have any comments, if you listen to this live, please do share them. I really would love to hear from you. But when I've shared this, when I've talked about this in various workshops, what I found is some very strong themes come up. Now, I'd like to caveat this to say, obviously, I think these are Disney representations of the fairy tales. And, some of them are almost 100 years old. I think that the Snow White one was in the 1930s, so 90 years old. Storytelling around women and young girls in stories is changing. We are seeing more empowering figures, more figures which are more active, more figures that are becoming the heroine of the story. Think things like Moana, for example, which is a great example. But even so, there are still these very strong stories that are still coming through and are part of our consciousness. Now, the themes for these three female protagonists are that, first of all, that they're usually cursed. Something has happened to them to put them in a state where they are not in full control of their life and their destiny. And usually that is an older woman, usually somebody who's jealous of them because of their youth and their vitality and their beauty. So automatically, we're getting some sort of messages here, which is that youth is preferable to old age. Old age in itself is something that we should be ashamed of, and something that creates bitterness and jealousy in us because we don't have the youth and beauty of these people. The other thing is that very strongly, these three are often seen as very passive figures. They're often waiting for somebody to rescue them, so they're in need of rescuing. And lo and behold, the person who usually rescues them is a man. So they get their power, they get their ability to have freedom, they get their ability to have status through the actions of a man that's helping them. Now, as I said, fairy stories are changing, fairy tales are changing, and the stories that we tell our young people, but there is still some very strong dimensions here about who's the passive gender and who's the active gender. Women passive, men are active. And yes, that's changing, but let's look at what we see as behaviours or behaviours we associate with gender even now. So some of what my conditioning was, so here's me as a very young woman, is that I was brought up in an Irish Catholic family. They were immigrants who moved over to England in the 1950s, where England at that time was very hostile to Irish people coming over, as they were to the people coming over on the from the Jamaican and African and Caribbean islands, who were also being brought over as there was a boom in England. There wasn't enough workers and they wanted people to come over. And as a result of that, they had very traditional views, very traditional values, my parents, which were not the same as the dominant culture they were living in. And I think anyone who's listening to this, anyone who's experienced this, is if you're part of a culture which is not the dominant culture, you're always reminded in some way of how you don't fit in. And the traditional values my parents had was very much about my role was going to be a wife and mother. Being a good girl in my parents' culture was about looking after the house and looking after the man of the house. And as a result of that, education was something that was useful, but only in terms of it was useful until you got married and looked after your house, looked after your man. Even to the point where I remember my mother was always ensuring that the meal was on the table for the man when he came home from work, my father, before any of us got fed. We always got fed, but there was something about the priority meal was always the man who was the breadwinner and was coming home and deserved his meal. And there was lots of messages I got growing up. So be a good girl and don't make a fuss. That was a very strong one. Be a good girl and do what you're told. Be a good girl and look after your, and it could be a whole range of people, mother, look after your father, look after your sister, basically look after anyone but yourself. So that caretaking role was very much expected. And I was brought up with three other siblings, two female and one male. And while there were messages given to my brother, there weren't about being a caretaker. They weren't there about being the person who looked after other people in the household. So that gender conditioning was something that I remember. I wasn't conscious of it at the time. It was something that as I got older, I became more aware of. And what's happening now? So if we think about boys versus girls, if I asked you, and I've done this poll several times in workshops, what is the behaviour that you expect to see in boys versus what you expect to see in girls? And I'd like you to just take a moment to think about that. What is the differences that you expect to see? And they are quite stark in terms of the differences. So what I'm going to share with you now is a typical word cloud that was the thing that was actually the words that were used by my audience when they were when they were sharing their thoughts around things. So let's have a look at what they are. So boys, what I've seen as typical things that came out as descriptions were impatient, loud, stubborn, disobedient, brave, confident, adventurous, athletic, curious, energetic, competitive, and probably the biggest descriptor of words that came out, it was often the biggest one on the word clouds, was strong. Strong was a really powerful word that came out again and again and again. So how does that compare with the way that we describe girls? Well, when we looked at it, we found that girls were described as helpful, as caring, as empathetic, compassionate, kind, honest, imaginative, supportive, friendly. And again, it doesn't come out strong in this word cloud, but nice. So if we looked at the dominant word that came out for girls, it was nice. So just think about that. That's two very strong words that oppose each other in very strong ways. Strong, nice. And that was just how we seen some of them behavioural traits, just on a very small poll when I had people on live workshops with me. And I wonder how many of them words, both of as a boy and as a girl, how many of them resonate with you, how many of them recognise for yourself, depending on your gender, how many of them you recognise in terms of your wider family, in terms of sons, daughters, brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles, and what are some of the differences that you're seeing in the behaviour as a result of that. And if we summarise how that comes out in terms of behaviours, I'm just going to share with you now a list of what they look like in terms of the behaviours that we see. So we see that for boys, it's about being active, roughhousing, sports, activities, assertive, goal orientated, in terms of having tasks which have a very specific goal around completion. Stoic, I think that's not quite the right word, but less expressive of their feelings, and actually very much discouraged to not show their feelings, such as crying. Even from a very young age, I hear people saying, especially to a boy, boys don't cry, you don't need to cry, and stifling the behaviours, and very much having narrow interests like trains, tractors, diggers, and all sorts of things like that. Girls, on the other hand, are encouraged to be supportive, and we see that in the word cloud that I've just shared with you, very much compassionate, empathetic, kind, and supportive. Lovely trait to have. I'm not saying it's a bad trait, but that's engaging in more nurturing play, and we've seen that in the previous photograph that I shared with you. They were actually playing doctors and nurses in that, playing with dolls, role playing, caring roles, or taking care of stuffed animals. Very much conciliatory in nature, striving to find harmony, process orientated as opposed to goal orientated. So the process of looking after people is enough for them rather than actually turning it into a goal. That's not all girls, that's not all boys as well, I hasten to say, but if we look at them across the majority of the population, these are what we find. Empathetic, which again came out in the word cloud, thinking about not only their own feelings, but of very much awareness of others, and self-image, which particularly as they get older, as they get into the 9s, 10s, 11s and plus, much more focus on their appearance and how they come across to other people. And that gets stronger as they get older, particularly with the strength of pressure that they see in media, social media particularly. So we see that there's very different things going on under the surface in terms of the behaviour and the expectations of them behaviours. And why is that happening? And if we think about it, and if there's parents listening to this, I would say, give yourself a break, because I know that there's lots of parents out there who really strive as far as possible to bring their children up in gender neutral ways. But it's actually very hard to do, because it's not just parents, there's a whole series of active agents in society which are very much vested in creating these gender roles and creating these gender differences. And there's four key ones that we see. So the first one is family. So what we see families, yes, definitely parents have a role in this, but also the extended family, and that's particularly strong. Like my experience as a child is because the extended family were from another culture and living there. So all of my parents' direct relatives were actually still in Ireland. So the extended relatives had a very strong view of how we should behave as children, and the cultural and religious norms that were around as part of that family as well. The other one is peers. Peers are probably one of our strongest learning experiences as humans. We start to take notice of our peers from a very young age, from about 1.5, 2 years old, and parents of young children will actually share this with us. Is what they notice that their child, as they're out and about, will start to notice children of a similar age or very close age to them, and start to observe their behaviour much more strongly than people in other age groups. So peers are a really strong learning one, intuitive in us. And so we're observing what they're happening preschool, during school age, during clubs and societies that we go to. And there are lots of norms imposed on us as children based on the gender expectations in our peers. Society as a whole also has a very strong influence on the gender socialisation. So that's both the ethnic and racial group norms that we may be part of, religious groups, but also political groups and the political parties and the expectations they impose, and other educational, political and legal institutions, and again the expectations they might create. And then the final one might be mainstream media, and more and more the rise and rise and rise of social media. So we know that the influencers across a whole range of different social media platforms can have a strong influence on expected behaviours or acceptable behaviours, or behaviours that we would see um, as something that we should be striving to, and that's having a very strong influence, both on boys and girls, but particularly in girls in terms of then influencing their view on self-image and how they should come across in the world. So I always say to parents, give yourself a break, because it's hardwired into so many of the aspects of the influencing around us in terms of the way that we are encouraging boys to be boys and girls to be girls, and the different behaviours that come out in them. So let's look at what ways that can show up for women as they grow up, as they enter the workplace, and as they start to express themselves. Well, what we know is, we already see, imbalance in the workplace in terms of when we get beyond the first level leaders and going up the leadership chain, that there's an imbalance in terms of gender straight away, to the point where at the top level of organisations, so at the level of CEO or direct reports of CEOs in organisations, they are overwhelmingly men. It's in fact 75% men to women. So we have very strong differences, but all of them would have entered the workplace pretty much equally. Men and women equally qualified, equally able. So what is getting in the way? Well, what we find is that if women have been brought up in this good girl condition, this good girl mold, what we see is that there's different things happening. So the first one is striving to be perfect, and we see perfectionism does happen across both genders, but overwhelmingly we see, I think it's 3 to 1, women to men really strive for this whole idea of being perfect, being a perfect girl, being a perfect good girl, and actually having perfectionism as a very strong character trait. And what that leads to is a number of things which really don't help long term. Excuse me, I'm going to take a drink. This is how you know it's live. Just parched there. Um, they tend to set impossible high goals. They tend to sweat the small stuff, and they tend to be people who are micromanagers, both of themselves, of constantly having a voice that's saying more, 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 more work, input, detail. But they also do that to others as well, which really does get in the way of their reputation and their success. Imposter syndrome, again, I would say imposter syndrome goes across both genders, but what we see is that it's a 2 to 3 times more likely in women than men. And what does imposter syndrome mean? Imposter syndrome means that regardless of all of the proof out there that somebody has achieved their success because they're capable, because they're able to do it, because they deserve to do it, they will constantly be questioning, but I'm not really. Somebody's going to find me out. Somebody's going to point me out and say I shouldn't be here. So that constant negative voice, doubting ability is what imposter syndrome is. And that doubting of abilities means that women tend to downplay their accomplishments. And by not expressing what they've achieved, by not sharing that with other people, they get undervalued, they get undernoticed, and so they're not as visible in the workplace. So when opportunities come up, when people are discussing promotion, their name's not coming up on a regular basis. The other thing we know, and this is around about a 2 to 1 comparison between male and female, so women are 2 times less likely to negotiate than men, is that hesitation to negotiate, which is again, if you think about that fairy tale bit I talked about, the passivity that we encourage girls and young women to embrace, is that we accept what we're given as women. That hesitation to negotiate means that the what we are seeing now, the gender pay gap, is part of this hesitation to negotiate. So what we find is men are twice as likely to negotiate their starting salary, even if it's an entry level job, than women are. And each level going up, they again are more likely to negotiate, ask for more, what more can be put on the table, what more can you give me in terms of a sign on bonus or additional bonus, performance bonus. Goals that I can actually achieve. Again, that goal versus process orientated in the gender socialization. And good girls tend to wait, assume that the organization will notice their great work and reward them accordingly. So we know that creates an inequality in terms of pay. Leadership challenge also show up with good girl mold. What do they come out with? So it's things like being assertive in leadership roles. Now, I coach a lot of women in terms of their career and their leadership. And what I find is women really struggle to take on that assertive voice because they're getting so many messages, both current messages and past messages, that to be assertive, to be direct, to be forceful, to be authoritative in their voice and their approach is to be unladylike, to be unfeminine, to not be nice, to not be supportive of other people. So there's real dichotomy going on about how do I show up as a leader that is taking control, that is being assertive, that is showing my ability without being unladylike and being unfeminine. So there's a real challenge there about how they do that. And again, a lot of my coaching with women is actually helping them through that, helping them through the thoughts, the behaviours, the myths, the limiting beliefs that have actually got them to the point where they're downplaying their ability to be a leader because they feel that that's expected of them as a female leader. And again, males don't have that going on. They don't have that inner voice. There are men who struggle to be assertive, I have to say that, but again, it's proportionately we see more women struggling with that than men. And the final one, and it's very much linked to the first one, is the fear of failure. So if I'm being told on a regular basis to be a good girl, I have a fear of failure. If I fail, I've let people down. I've not been a good girl. I've not been perfect, and I'm not meeting other people's expectations. So if we have that fear of failure, what it leads to is very risk averse behaviour. We don't stick our neck out. We don't push for things that maybe would be helpful for ourselves and the people around us, and that gets in the way of us taking chances. It also hinders our growth, and it hinders our ability to achieve things that probably would give us more fulfillment in life. So we know these things are getting in the way, and they're all part of what we're seeing as gender socialization. So even as I talk about things, you might think, well, are these things showing up in my workplace? Are these things that either I'm doing, both as a woman and as a man, because we both genders reinforce gender socialization. It's not just a something that men are keeping men in a certain role and women are keeping men in a certain role. Both genders reinforce these stereotypes. It's quite important to think about that. And also, what it does is it has quite subtle ways that it's showing up at work. So let me share some of them with you. So some of the ways that we might be reinforcing this good girl mold, one of them is assuming that a female colleague will be a note taker at a meeting. So if this is a meeting where equally it's women and men that are represented, it's more likely that the majority of the meeting will look to a female colleague in that meeting to be a note taker. Also asking female colleagues to sort out refreshments for a meeting. Again, if it's equally male and female, why would it automatically be females that are asked to do this? Have a think about this. Can you see these as behaviours going on in your workplace? And one of the ones that was shared with me recently was an observation in one organisation, which is that things like social events, birthday gifts, or cards to be signed, retirement parties, and so on, often that looking after people, acknowledging, finding celebrations is left to the female colleagues. In fact, one of them said, I actually don't see that I've ever seen a male colleague taking responsibility for any of these events. And again, that's just one of the ways that we can often expect women to do something just because of this good girls conditioning. Other things are more subtle, so not keeping female colleagues up to date with opportunities or interesting projects. There might be lots of reasons for that. They may not have been at the meeting, they may not be at the forums, but the network where these things go out to and the people hear about them are more likely to be networks where men are in and hearing this and understanding this than females. And we know that they hear about opportunities more often. They're encouraged to go after these opportunities more often than their female colleagues. So again, thinking about, is that happening in your workplace? One of the ones I've talked about in my blog, and I'll share my blog with you, is over talking female colleagues in meetings. That may be something that happened in your organisation. It may not, but it's something that until we start making an effort to identify and observe, we're often not aware of because it's quite subtle. And if you're in very busy meetings, if there's lots of people that have got lots of things to say, there may be over talking going on all the time. However, it may be something that you're not aware of in terms of the fact that we know from research where researchers have gone in and they've observed this and then looked at the data is women are 3 times more likely to be interrupted while they're talking than men. And what that means is their voice is downplayed, their voice isn't heard. And another thing that happens is that females who make a suggestion and it's pushed aside, a male colleague making the same suggestion in the same meeting but a little later is more likely to be jumped on and seen as a good idea. So there's something about how we view voices and how we view authority and downplaying women and their voices and their contribution than men. That could be something you observe. If you use any translation tool like there's Otter AI and a number of others, and actually look and do an analysis, you might see whether that's going on. And the other thing is just not being an ally to female colleagues who are struggling to be heard. Again, one of the recent articles I did on LinkedIn and I do on my blog is looking at something that happened to a female MP in the UK, and she's the longest serving female Black MP, Diane Abbott. And there was an issue about some racist remarks, very racist remarks that had been said about her, and it started a debate in Parliament. She was in Parliament during the time of that debate, and she tried to stand up 46 times. It's actually recorded and it was shown, to actually make her voice heard. And every single time, the speaker with the voice ignored her and allowed other people in. There were female voices, there were other MPs' voices, but her voice, the person who was at the centre of the debate and probably had something to add to that debate, was not allowed in. And I asked the question when I looked at that, is like, where were her allies? Where were the people who could have stood up and said, Speaker, and then been acknowledged and says, yes, I just want to allow Diane Abbott to come in and speak, because I've noticed that we're ignoring her. And allies to female colleagues can be both female and male. This is not just about men helping being a strong ally and support of women, although that's really important. All change has happened through majority culture helping minority culture to be heard. So they're really important, but other women helping women as well. We've all got a role to play here. So thinking about how is that maybe happening now that we're not being an ally to women who are in the minority, who are the only voice in the room because there's other intersectionality, the only female lesbian voice in the room, the only the female Black voice in the room, the only female disabled voice in the room, and it's the ways that we can be an ally to them as well. So here's some suggestions I've got for you around how you can break that mold. One of them, I always say, it starts with awareness, because it's only while we're aware of our behaviour that we can start to think about, okay, I have been responding in this way. Is there another alternative way of me being? Is reflect on your behaviour, both men and women. What is the gender and the stereotypes that you might be playing into that you could change? Either ones about who's strong and the ones about who's nice and all of the other connotations of them things. And does that reflect in the way that you're making decisions, who you're choosing to bring together if you're putting together project teams, in choosing who you think is a suitable candidate for a certain role? It's amazing how many of them subtle things are going on just under the surface. And thinking about things like, is there ways of swapping roles? Is it possible for different team members to try out different roles to learn from each other? Is one person always the dominant voice of the person who facilitates or chairs meetings? Could that be swapped to somebody of a different gender or a different level in the hierarchy who could take that role? And what can we learn from actually doing them swaps? And the other thing I think is really important is to find safe spaces to explore your gender. And, I think that's important for both men and women. I know that there's lots of female only groups out there, particularly in organisations where they encourage female employee networks. And I think that's great. And I think it's really important for women because they have had this socialisation around not having a voice or not being clear about it to find their voice. I think it's equally important for men to have that safe space as well. How do men in the modern world find out what it means to be a man, what it means to be a man who is fully able to express himself, but in a way that he's also able to hear, understand, feel comfortable with strong female women alongside him as well. So, where are the places where you can do that? And actually looking at what you can do to find that journey for yourself. So, I encourage that for both. So, a few things that I would encourage you to do if you're watching this and you found it useful. So, if you're a woman and Good Girl is a trigger for you and you recognize it, what I'd say is build a habit around assertive communication. So, over the next week or month, maybe make an intention to speak up at one meeting or event where you wouldn't normally remain quiet. Now, I think that's particularly challenging in this more virtual world that we live in, where a lot of our meetings are on Teams or Zoom or whatever other platform, where it's actually sometimes difficult to get our voice. And maybe as a woman, you've just learned to be quiet and let it go. And it's like, no, start to make an intention that in every meeting you're going to find a way to just come in, to interject, to share a view, to share a thought with them, just so you start to feel more comfortable getting your voice out there. Also, think about how you can strengthen your negotiation skills. This tends to be another strong one I deal with when I'm coaching women. It's the real issue for them about how they negotiate. And it doesn't have to be a financial negotiation, it can be a negotiation around boundaries at work, it can be a negotiation around the role that you want to be coached and developed into in the future. It could be negotiation around promotion, it could be negotiation around salary. So it doesn't always have to be the big negotiation, the one that might trigger lots of emotion. But learning to negotiate is something that's really important. Asking for something that you want, either from a colleague or from somebody that actually can help you this week or this month. Or if it's not something you feel ready to start negotiating, think about a skill you could take, a course you could take to upskill you, whether in your organisation, there's online courses that allow you to do that, or whether there's actually something you can learn. There's lots of online platforms out there, LinkedIn Learning being one, and many others, where you could actually take a short course on negotiation and help you with that. And finally, think about how ways you can be an ally. Are there people out there you could reach out? Is there a female colleague, and maybe a new member of staff, a new member of the team, one of those onlys in the team, that you could actually reach out and help to be a support for them, be an ally, improve them in terms of them finding an active voice or improve their visibility? So think about that. And is there something you could do to be more active this month? So that's it. I hope you found that helpful. What I'd like to say to you is, if you want to keep in touch, there's a number of things that you can do. So here's my oh no, further reading. Sorry, 4 books that are great for reading. One of them, obviously my own. I would say that that's a really good one, The Female Edge. But there's also some great books out there. The Unwritten Rules of Female Leadership is from a friend of mine, Helen Appleby. Another great one. Really, really practical tips in there. The brilliant Mary Ann Sieghart has The Authority Gap, which talks about how we are constantly reducing the authority, undermining women, and ways we can address that. And then a wonderful book by Thomas Chamorro Peruzzi's, I struggle saying his name, Why Do So Many Incompetent Men Become Leaders and How to Fix It? So thinking about some of the things that we can do there. If you found this useful, I'd love to keep the conversation going. So here's where you can get in touch with me, Mary Agents to Change. I'm obviously on LinkedIn if you're watching it, and if you're watching it on my other channels, please reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm always happy to have new connections, and I'm regularly on Twitter. And here's some of my contact details there that you can find me as well. I regularly post on my blog. My blog in Agents to Change is very much not only gender but also other wider areas of diversity. But also you can find me. You can find some specific articles around Good Girl Mold that I did a blog to recently. So on my agentstochange.com/blog, you'll find lots of details there. If you get in touch, I can put you on my regular newsletters, and I'd love to hear from you. So if you've got any thoughts, if you've got any reflections, if there's anything you'd like me to either cover more, go into detail in future LinkedIn Lives, please get in touch either through the comments, through instant messenger, or via email, and I'd love to help you. Thank you so much for your time today. I hope you found that useful, and as always, I'm wishing you a great day, and I look forward to our next interaction in about 2 or 3 weeks' time. So have a great rest of the day. Thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it.